Dr. Graeme MacQueen received his Ph.D. in Comparative Religion from Harvard University and taught in the Religious Studies Department of McMaster University for 30 years. In 1989, he became the founding director of the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster. He has also contributed to the development of the Women's Peace Brigade in North India. For the past 5 years, most of Graeme's research has focused on the events and anomalies of the 9/11 attacks. He has written 4 research articles on the subject and has given many talks and interviews on the topic. Professor Graeme MacQueen joins us in studio. Good afternoon, Graeme, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Barry. It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you in studio. So, Professor MacQueen, how did you get interested in the events of September 11th, 2001?
Well, I suppose as somebody in peace studies, anything that has dramatic violence and looks like it's going to trigger a huge war would be of interest to me, so it was. But there were really quite specific reasons in my case. We had a project going trying to build peace among Afghans. I had been in Peshawar, Pakistan, just across the border from Afghanistan in February 2001 with a group of people working for about a week really hard with a lot of Afghan leaders, a huge expatriate community of Afghans. The Afghan University was there. They sponsored our trip. We had about 100 Afghan leaders, political, journalists, spiritual leaders, and so on, working with us to try and solve some of these problems. And some of them seemed to be potentially soluble. I mean, there was some progress. And the Taliban showed up one day, they didn't try and close us down or anything. So I was feeling relatively optimistic. And then a very well-dressed Afghan gentleman stood up at some point after a lot of good brainstorming had gone on, and he said, many fine ideas for establishing peace in Afghanistan have come up today, my friends. But alas, none of them will come to fruition because the United States is soon going to invade Afghanistan. It's after the carbon resources of the region. He presumably meant Central Asia at that time.
When did he say this?
Well, I don't have the date, but it was February 2001.
February 2001,
yeah.
Okay.
So several months before September 11th. And I kind of was perplexed, I didn't think I was very naive, but I couldn't imagine why the United States would invade Afghanistan, this one of the most wretched, poor countries in the world, and also a place that had proved, had been doomed, really, for most of the imperial powers that invaded there, including the Soviet Union. So why on earth would you do that? Anyway, when September 11th happened, I should have been more critical than I was. I should have said, gee, maybe the U.S. Isn't going to invade Afghanistan because of 9/11. Maybe this was all worked out in advance. But the truth is, I accepted, with some reservations, the official story. It seemed natural, right? The planes are bashing into the buildings are coming down. It's a good yarn. And I kept looking for evidence, mind you. When I look back at speeches I gave at that time, I said, well, we're being told it's Al-Qaeda. We haven't actually seen any evidence yet. But you get lazy. I got lazy. And when I look back at my talks, I find that for a while after that, I just fell into thinking, well, I guess it must have been Al-Qaeda, even though I had never seen any good evidence for that position. So then I became aware that there were people who were questioning the whole thing. I was not one of the first out of the starting blocks on this. And I thought, well, that's an interesting possibility. And I did not rule it out because I've been in the business of, looking at wars for so long and have seen so much fraud, so much violence, that whereas some people continue to say they find it inconceivable that the U.S. government could itself be involved in orchestrating these attacks, that was never really an issue for me. I could conceive it. I didn't regard it as impossible. So my position was that it was possible, but unlikely. And I wouldn't go that route until I had seen some pretty solid evidence.
So at that point, you were still thinking, maybe the way we heard from the President of the United States, that's what really happened?
Sure. I thought, yeah, that's probably what happened. but let's keep a little part of our mind open for an alternative possibility. And I started a file, on this alternative possibility. We come back to it from time to time. And it wasn't until 2005 that I finally was challenged by someone to kind of get my act together. This is so important, and do some serious research and reading. And I did, and quickly concluded that the official story is a tissue of lies and deception.
Well, what points stand out in this, quote, tissues of lies and deception?
Well, I have to say that no matter where you begin your investigation of 9/11, you find a little thread and you pull it and the whole thing starts to come apart. So whether it's NORAD's claims about what the planes were doing and when NORAD was informed and why they couldn't get fighter jets up to stop, if you can concentrate on that one, you can look at the so-called 19 hijackers. Were they really competent? Did they really have the skills to do what they did on 9/11? And I looked at those things briefly, but in the end, the thing that convinced me is the thing that people keep coming back to again and again and again, and it's the buildings. The World Trade Center was this huge vertical construction in southern Manhattan. I've been there, and I was there, in fact, giving a talk last year, and I visited the site. 3 enormous buildings came down at astonishing speed and were
free fall, basically.
Well, the towers weren't quite free fall, but World Trade 7, which I hope your listeners are aware was never hit by a plane at all.
Well, tell us briefly about World Trade Center in case people aren't aware of the third tower.
All right, okay, because it's definitely one of the smoking guns in this whole thing. So here we have a big building, 47 stories high. It's not big for southern Manhattan, but I'm not sure we have a building that high in my city, Hamilton. I don't know if you have a building that high up here.
In Toronto, the First Canadian Place is pretty similar.
Oh, Toronto has
yes.
buildings that high, sure.
Yes.
But I guess what I'm saying is that was a big building. It was, and it was built apparently very well. Solid steel construction, something like 82 vertical steel columns, and so on and so forth. Now, the building is apparently damaged during the day. It appears when the North Tower, which was across the street from it, came down, there was some damage to Building 7, right?
There were fires in Building 7.
Yeah, but
yes.
they weren't next to each other, and there was a building in between, World Trade 6. So there's some damage, and possibly because of that, fires begin in World Trade 7, okay? And there may have been fires on as many as 8 or 10 floors at one point.
Now, Graeme, different guests on my show over the years have said the fires were incidental or very, very severe. So how do we know how severe the fires were in World Trade Center 7?
Well, we have various sorts of evidence, mostly photographic, video. National Institute for Standards and Technology has tried to sort out, at what times of the day various floors were burning. But here's the thing. The fires were burning out, okay, as the day went on. By the time this building underwent its utterly bizarre collapse at 5:20 in the afternoon, there were only significant fires on about 3 floors. Now, this is a big, strong building. It's standing there apparently solid, right? People are looking at it. It's not toppling or anything. And there are fires on about 3 floors. And at just after 5:20, suddenly, down it comes. Now, it comes down symmetrically, extremely rapidly, and utterly. Just the whole thing is gone in about 6.5 seconds. And if you've seen a building that big, picture it coming down that fast. It's just mind-boggling. Now, again, I've been to the site. I've been to the new World Trade 7, which is built to replace that. It was a big building. And, stand at the bottom of it and picture that coming down in that many seconds. Now, we have a lot of video footage of this, and it's quite easy to measure, and make calculations. What was the acceleration? What was the velocity at various times? What was the overall collapse time? I don't know how long you want me to go on with this, but shall I say a little bit more about why this is such a big deal?
Sure, it's very important.
Okay. Well, the National Institute of Standards and Technology was tasked, I believe, in 2002, that's a division of the U.S. Department of Commerce, to investigate World Trade 7 and its collapse. And they had a lot of trouble, and they kept stalling and stalling. Why the heck did this building come down? There were all kinds of theories. Finally, they came out with their report in fall of 2008. And among other things, I mean, there's all kinds of bizarre things in this report, but one of the things that's bizarre is that in the initial draft of the report in August, they had tried to get rid of this issue of how fast the building came down by pretending that it was, a relatively slow, gradual collapse. But, we're not fools. We can measure this collapse. We've got several different really good videos of it.
Well, you can see it on YouTube.
Yeah. Yep. And, if you know how to take apart videos frame by frame, and if you know the dimensions of the building, you can work it out. I mean, I'm not a physical scientist, but I can work it out, okay? So it's not rocket science. So naturally, when they gave a press conference, David Chandler, a guy I know who's a physics teacher from California, said, "Excuse me, but you've got this wrong. It was in free fall for at least part of its fall." And just so everybody knows, free fall acceleration is what happens when there's no resistance. If I were to throw a stone off the top of World Trade 7 into the air, it would undergo free fall acceleration. It would keep accelerating, getting faster and faster at a particular rate. And when David Chandler said this, there was great confusion in the NIST panel. They all kind of shuffled papers and looked at each other, and the lead investigator, Shyam Sundar, said, "Well, that couldn't be. If it was free fall, it would mean there were no resistance at all." which is the point, okay? It's the point. How could 82 steel columns completely, suddenly, and symmetrically give way so that they didn't give any more resistance than air?
So, Graeme, in the report, through NIST, how do they explain it coming down in free fall?
Well, see, initially they denied it. Now, once they were confronted, they had to go back to the drawing board. The jig was up on that one. So in the final report, which came out a few months later, they admit that for 2.25 seconds, which is over 100 feet of collapse, the building was in absolute free fall, indistinguishable from a rock. And then the rest of the collapse was just slightly more than free fall. There's a bit of resistance. But they tuck it in, there it is, in a little line, as if it doesn't matter, as if it's a trivial issue. Well, excuse me, it's not trivial. When steel turns to nothing, it gives absolutely structural steel in this well-built building symmetrically, meaning all 82 columns had to give way more or less at the same time and turn into nothing, basically. That calls for explanation. And their explanation, which is gradual buckling of columns, through heat and I could get into it, but it's a gradual process. With cumulative buckling. It starts at one part of the building, it spreads to other. That just doesn't make it. You don't get a symmetrical free fall collapse from that. And this is why this is a smoking gun. Basically, their story violates the laws of physics. And it forces us to ask the questions, what could have destroyed completely the resistance of 82 steel columns in a few instants? What do you feel destroyed those columns in an instant? It was clearly a controlled demolition, so there were charges of some kind, possibly also various incendiaries to cut the steel, and they were knocked out, and then the building came down. It looks like a beautiful, perfect controlled demolition. You have to look hard on the internet, actually, to find a controlled demolition as good as this one. Mm-hmm. It's so well done. So I would encourage all listeners to, Google World Trade Center 7 collapse, YouTube, and there it is. You'll watch it. Storming had gone on, and he said, many fine ideas for establishing peace in Afghanistan have come up today, my friends. But alas, none of them will come to fruition because the United States is soon going to invade Afghanistan. It's after the carbon resources of the region. He presumably meant Central Asia at that time.
When did he say this?
Well, I don't have the date, but it was February 2001.
February 2001,
yeah.
Okay.
So several months before September 11th. And I kind of was perplexed.
Dr. Graeme MacQueen received his Ph.D. in comparative religion from Harvard University and taught in the Religious Studies Department of McMaster University for 30 years. In 1989, he became the founding director of the Center for Peace Studies at McMaster. He has also contributed to the development of the Women's Peace Brigade in North India. For the past 5 years, most of Graeme's research has focused on the events and anomalies of the 9/11 attacks. He has written 4
interest to me, so it was. But there were really quite specific reasons in my case. We had a project going trying to build peace among Afghans. I had been in Peshawar, Pakistan, just across the border from Afghanistan in February 2001 with a group of people working for about a week really hard with a lot of Afghan leaders, a huge expatriate community of Afghans. The Afghan University was there. They sponsored our trip. We had about 100 Afghan leaders, political, journalists, spiritual leaders, and so on, working with us to try and solve some of these problems. And some of them seemed to be potentially soluble. I mean, there was some progress. And the Taliban showed up one day, they didn't try and close us down or anything. So I was feeling relatively optimistic. And then a very well-dressed Afghan gentleman stood up at some point after a lot of good brain
search articles on the subject and has given many talks and interviews on the topic. Professor Graeme MacQueen joins us in studio. Good afternoon, Graeme, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Barry. It's good to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you in studio. So, Professor MacQueen, how did you get interested in the events of September 11th, 2001?
Well, I suppose as somebody in peace studies, anything that has dramatic violence and looks like it's going to trigger a huge war would be of